Imagine yourself in absolute darkness, thousands of feet above an enemy-held country. There is no engine roar, only the high-pitched, lonely whistle of wind tearing through the wooden frame around you. You are hurtling through the night at over 100 miles an hour in a box made of plywood and canvas, a contraption so fragile it feels like a strong gust could tear it apart. You are pressed against the bodies of other men, their equipment digging into your ribs, the combined smell of sweat, oil, and stale air thick in your throat. Your hands are cold, your knuckles white as you grip the stock of your rifle. In your mind, you run the plan over and over, a desperate mantra against the churning fear in your gut. You are a glider trooper, and you are on your way to do the impossible. This is the world of the airborne soldier who chose the glider over the parachute. They were a different breed, volunteers for a role that promised no glory, only a one-way ticket into the heart of darkness. They were the tip of the spear, delivered in silence and with terrifying precision. And in the cold early hours of a June morning in 1944, not 40 but 180 of these men would be tasked with a mission that defied all logic, a mission that military textbooks would later label as suicidal. They were to take two bridges, not just any bridges, but a stone and steel monolith and its sister, a vital artery in the German war machine, guarded by hundreds of the enemy's best soldiers. This is the story of that mission, a story that has been overshadowed by the larger, more famous battles of D-Day, but which contains in its microcosm every element of courage, terror, and brutal genius that defined the conflict. It is a story that has been waiting in the shadows for decades, a story about what happens when a small group of men decide that impossible odds are simply a suggestion, and that the fate of an invasion can rest on the shoulders of a few silent, flying coffins. To understand the sheer audacity of what happened at the Orne River and the German Canal, you must first understand the world that created this mission. By 1943, the Allies were winning the war, but they were not yet ending it. In North Africa, German and Italian forces were on the brink of total surrender, a massive victory that would secure the Mediterranean. In the Atlantic, the tide had turned against the U-boats. But on the ground in Europe, the continent remained a fortress. The Soviet Union was bleeding the Wehrmacht white on the Eastern Front, suffering losses on a scale that was almost incomprehensible to the West. Stalin was growing increasingly desperate, demanding a second front in France to draw German divisions away from his armies. "You must understand," he had pleaded to Churchill and Roosevelt, "the situation is grave." The pressure was immense, but the Allies were not ready. A full-scale cross-channel invasion was a logistical and military nightmare, an operation that could fail catastrophically and set the war back by years. What they could do, however, was probe. They could test the German defenses, stretch their resources, and prove to the Soviets and to themselves that they were committed to fighting in Europe. This led to the birth of a new kind of warfare, the pinprick raid. Small, elite forces striking specific high-value targets, causing maximum chaos for minimum cost. It was in this environment that the glider came into its own. The concept was not new. Gliders had been used in small numbers by the Germans in their assault on the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael in 1940, a stunning success that had not gone unnoticed by Allied planners. The British had begun their own glider program, but it was slow, underfunded, and seen by many in the traditional army establishment as a bit of a gimmick, a flashy but unreliable waste of resources. They preferred the solidity of tanks and infantry, the proven methods of war. But a small group of visionary officers, including the formidable Major General Frederick Boy Browning, saw something else. They saw a weapon that could deliver a punch far beyond its weight. The problem with paratroopers was dispersion. The wind, the fear, the anti-aircraft fire, all of it scattered men across the countryside. It could take hours for a company to regroup, hours they didn't have in a hot landing zone. The glider offered a terrifying, elegant solution. It was a pilotable aircraft, silent and almost invisible to radar once released from its tow plane. It could deliver a full squad of soldiers, complete with their weapons, ammunition, jeeps, and even light artillery, all landing in the same place, ready to fight within seconds of the skids hitting the ground. It was the ultimate expression of shock and surprise, a way to put an entire fighting unit, with its teeth intact, directly into the enemy's soft underbelly. But this precision came at a horrifying human cost. The primary glider used by the British, the airspeed Horsa, was a masterpiece of functional disposability. It was a vast, ungainly beast, made almost entirely of wood, fabric, and metal tubing, designed to be strong enough for one flight and one flight only. It could carry 30 troops or a jeep and an anti-tank gun, but there was no armor. The pilots sat exposed behind a plexiglass windscreen that would shatter under the slightest impact. The infantrymen sat on simple canvas benches down the sides of the fuselage, their bodies just inches from the thin skin of the aircraft. A single burst of anti-aircraft fire wouldn't just damage the glider, it would obliterate it, turning the men inside into part of the wreckage. Every man who boarded a glider knew, with a cold and absolute certainty, that the machine carrying them was their coffin. The only question was whether they would get to use it as a weapon before they had to lie in it. The psychological toll of this knowledge was a unique and brutal form of combat stress. Paratroopers had the adrenaline of the fall, the brief, terrifying freedom of the descent. Glider troopers had a long, slow, agonizing anticipation. They sat in that creaking, vibrating darkness for hours, often in rough weather, listening to the whistle of the wind and the distant, muffled drone of the tow plane, a sound that could vanish at any second, leaving them plummeting. They had time to think, time to picture the flak, the searchlights, the trees, the telegraph poles. Time to contemplate the odds. This was a role that attracted a very specific kind of soldier. Not the reckless thrill-seeker, but the hardened pragmatist, the man who could look at a one-way mission and see not a death sentence, but a tactical problem to be solved. They were volunteers, every single one of them, and their training was as grueling as it was specialized. They practiced crash landings day and night in every conceivable terrain, until the violent, bone-jarring stop became second nature. They learned to exit a wrecked fuselage in seconds, their weapons already up and firing. They developed an almost telepathic bond with their fellow soldiers, a unit cohesion forged in the shared understanding that their lives depended entirely on one another's flawless performance under unimaginable pressure. The accident rate during training was appalling, a grim testament to the dangers of the machine. Men died in training crashes in England, their lives lost before they ever saw the enemy. For those who continued, it was a daily reminder of the pact they had made with fate. This content is only supported in Alark Docs. The men selected for this mission were not just any glider troops. They were the best of the best, a hand-picked team from D Company, 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, part of the British 6th Airborne Division. They were to be delivered by pilots from the Glider Pilot Regiment. Their commander was a 32-year-old major named John Howard, a former police officer from London with a reputation for quiet professionalism and an almost unnerving calm under fire. He was not a stereotypical sandbag-kicking officer. He was a thinker, a planner, a man who led by respect rather than fear. He had drilled his men relentlessly for months, focusing not just on the broad strokes of the plan, but on every conceivable contingency. What if the glider landed short? What if it landed long? What if the pilot was killed on impact? Every man knew not only his own job, but the job of the man next to him and the man next to him. They were a single multi-limbed organism, honed to a razor's edge for a single impossible task. On the other side of the bridges, the enemy was waiting. The defenders were not the crack, fanatical SS troops that would be encountered later in the campaign, but they were a formidable force nonetheless. They were from the 736th Grenadier Regiment, part of the 716th Static Infantry Division. The division was composed largely of very young men, older men, and those deemed not fit enough for frontline service on the Eastern Front. But they were commanded by experienced German NCOs and officers, and they were well entrenched. They had been in the area for months, turning the ground around the two bridges, the the Caen Canal Bridge and the Orne River Bridge, located just a few hundred yards apart, into a fortress. The bridges were a critical component of the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's grand defensive line against the expected invasion. If the Allies were ever to land in Normandy, these bridges would have to be captured intact to prevent German armor from racing to the beaches and crushing the invasion force. The Germans knew this. The eastern approaches were protected by thick barbed wire entanglements, anti-tank ditches, and machine gun nests housed in concrete pillboxes. The western banks were studded with more machine guns and a 50mm anti-tank gun, perfectly positioned to sweep the bridge approaches. The entire area was patrolled by a full battalion of over 600 men. Their commander, Major Hans Schmidt, was a competent but unimaginative officer who had served in the First World War. He believed in the strength of his fortifications and the discipline of his men. He had heard the British propaganda about airborne raids, but he had seen nothing. To him and his men, the bridges were impregnable. They had a routine. They had a sense of security. They were confident, perhaps even complacent. They had no idea that a silent, flying army was already on its way to turn their world upside down. Inside a stuffy Nissen hut at an airfield in southern England, Major John Howard stood before his men. A large map of the target area was pinned to the wall, covered in grease pencil markings. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the low hum of nervous energy. Howard's voice was low and steady, cutting through the tension. "Gentlemen," he began, his eyes scanning the faces of his men, "the objective is the bridge over the Orne River and the bridge over the Caen Canal. Intelligence reports a full battalion of German infantry defending the area. We will be attacking with less than 2 companies. On paper, we are outnumbered 3-1. He paused, letting the weight of that statistic sink in. A few men shifted uncomfortably on their wooden benches. "On paper," Howard repeated, his voice gaining a slight edge. "But the Germans are expecting a division, not a raid. They are expecting an attack from the sea, not from the sky. They are expecting noise and confusion and a long, bloody fight. We are not going to give them any of that. We are going to give them silence. We are going to give them speed. We are going to give them a shock so profound that they will not have time to react before it is too late." He pointed to the map with a long stick. 6 gliders, 3 for the canal bridge, 3 for the river bridge. The first glider for each objective will land directly on the bridge itself, stopping the enemy from using it and deploying troops to secure the near bank. The second will land 60 yards beyond the bridge, taking out the machine gun and anti-tank positions on the far bank. The third will land on the near bank, securing our approach and preventing any counterattack from that direction. The entire operation must be completed in 10 minutes. 10 minutes and the bridges are ours. Any questions? There were none. The men had been over the plan 100 times. They knew their roles, their landing zones, their primary and secondary targets. They knew the names of the men in their glider, the serial number of their rifle, the exact weight of the explosives they would carry. There was nothing left to say. The plan was simple, direct, and utterly dependent on perfect execution and the element of surprise. There was no room for error. There was no plan B. On the night of June 5, 1944, the men of the assault force ate their final meal. It was a quiet affair. Some wrote letters, the scratch of their pens the only sound in the barracks. Others cleaned their weapons for the 10th time, the methodical clicks and clacks a familiar, comforting rhythm. A few just sat, staring into space, lost in their own thoughts. They knew the statistics. They knew that glider assault units suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any military specialty. They knew that many of them would not see the sunrise. But there was no fear in their eyes, only a grim, focused determination. They had a job to do. As dusk fell, they were driven out to the airfield where the 6 Horsa gliders stood waiting, their bulky shapes silhouetted against the fading light. Ground crews swarmed over them, making final checks. The men, weighed down with nearly 70 pounds of equipment each, climbed aboard through the side hatches. They found their places on the wooden benches, buckling themselves in. The interior was dark and smelled of wood varnish and canvas. The pilots, a mix of Royal Air Force and Army Air Corps officers, went through their final pre-flight checks. Then, with a lurch and a groan of the tow rope, the gliders began to move, trundling across the grass field behind the powerful Halifax bombers that would pull them into the night. Imagine yourself inside one of those gliders as it lifts off the ground. The transition from the bumping of the wheels on the grass to the smooth, silent ascent is immediate and disorienting. The only sound is the rush of air outside and the distant, muffled roar of the four engines of the Halifax bomber ahead, a sound that feels both like a lifeline and a target. You are flying low, just a few hundred feet above the English countryside, the patchwork of fields and hedgerows slipping away beneath you. You cross the coast, and below you, the moonlight glints off the dark, unforgiving water of the English Channel. The flight takes over an hour. It is an hour of pure, unadulterated tension. You cannot see the other gliders, but you know they are out there, strung out behind you in the darkness, each carrying a piece of the plan. You check your watch, the luminous dial a tiny point of light in the gloom. You run the plan through your head again. Exit the glider. Left flank. Suppress the pillbox. Cover the engineers. The words are a litany against the rising tide of adrenaline. Your mouth is dry. Your heart hammers against your ribs. Every jolt of turbulence, every shift in the wind sends a fresh jolt of anxiety through you. You are completely powerless, a passenger in a flying crate, hurtling towards a hornet's nest. Down below, on the bridges, the German sentries were beginning their night watch. Corporal Karl Schmidt, no relation to the major, shivered in his greatcoat. It was a cold night for June. He and his partner, a young private named Müller, had another 2 hours before they were relieved. The night was quiet, as it always was. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the gentle lapping of water against the canal banks. Müller was complaining, as usual, about the food, about the lack of leave, about the pointlessness of guarding a bridge in the middle of nowhere. Schmidt told him to be quiet. You never knew who was listening. He peered out into the darkness, his eyes straining. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. Up above, out of sight and out of mind, 6 silent dragons were gliding towards him. As you cross the French coast, the atmosphere changes. Below you, the blackout is total, but you can see the faint, ominous shapes of the coastline. The pilot, a young lieutenant named Den Brotheridge, turns and gives a thumbs up. 5 minutes to release. The tension in the fuselage becomes a physical presence, a palpable force that presses in on you from all sides. Men make final adjustments to their equipment, check the safeties on their weapons, whisper last-minute words of encouragement to their comrades. The smell of cordite from the weapon cleaning mixes with the sour scent of sweat. Then, the moment comes. There is a loud bang as the release mechanism fires, a sudden stomach-lurching drop, and then silence. The oppressive drone of the Halifax bomber is gone, replaced by the clean, terrifying whistle of the wind. You are on your own now, a ghost ship sailing silently towards its destiny. The pilot wrestles with the controls, fighting to keep the glider on course. You can see the searchlights from Caen sweeping the sky a few miles away, their beams cutting through the darkness like fingers of God. You hold your breath, praying they don't find you. The pilot pushes the glider into a steep dive, trading altitude for speed. The ground rushes up to meet you. You can make out the dark ribbon of the canal, the glint of water, the solid shape of the bridge. The landing is not a landing, it is a controlled crash. The glider hits the ground with a sickening crunch of splintering wood and tearing metal. You are thrown forward against your harness, the impact driving the air from your lungs. The skids screech along the ground, and then, with a final, shuddering lurch, the glider comes to a stop. It has stopped just feet from the edge of the bridge, its nose broken and its fuselage cracked. But it is in position. The door is thrown open. You are the first one out, stumbling into the night, your boots hitting the tarmac of the bridge. The air is filled with the shouts of men and the sound of small arms fire. Your training takes over. You raise your rifle, your eyes scanning for targets. You see the German sentry box at the far end of the bridge. You fire a 3-round burst. The sentry crumples to the ground. You are the first Allied soldier to kill a German on D-Day, though you don't know it yet. This content is only supported in Alarc Docs. The assault on the bridges has begun.
All 6 gliders landed within a few minutes of each other and, miraculously, within a few hundred yards of their designated landing zones. The surprise was total. The German sentries, who had been expecting a quiet night, were completely stunned. The first glider, carrying Lieutenant Den Brotheridge's platoon, landed directly on the canal bridge. Brotheridge himself was hit by a burst of machine gun fire as he led his men across the bridge, becoming the first fatal casualty of the invasion. But his men didn't stop. They kept moving, their objective clear in their minds. They cleared the near bank, silencing the German machine gun positions with grenades and disciplined rifle fire. Corporal Karl Schmidt never knew what hit him. One moment he was telling Miller to shut up. The next, the night was torn apart by an explosion of sound and light. A giant, winged beast had fallen from the sky and crashed onto the bridge. Men were pouring out of it, shouting in a language he didn't understand. He fumbled for his rifle, but a burst of fire caught him in the chest, and he slumped to the ground, his life extinguished in an instant. The war he had been waiting for had finally found him. And it was nothing like he had imagined. The second glider for the canal bridge landed a few seconds later, its nose crashing through the barbed wire entanglements on the far side of the canal. The men poured out, immediately engaging the German troops who were now scrambling from their barracks. A fierce firefight erupted at close quarters, but the British glider troops, using their superior training and the shock of the landing, quickly gained the upper hand. They systematically neutralized the pillboxes and machine gun nests that were supposed to protect the bridge, their movements fluid and efficient. On the Orne River Bridge, a few hundred yards away, the scene was being repeated with equal ferocity. The first glider landed perfectly, its skids scraping along the bridge deck and stopping just short of the far end. The men, led by a sergeant named Thornton, stormed out, their Sten guns chattering. They caught the German defenders completely by surprise, overrunning the sentry positions and securing the bridge itself within seconds. The second glider landed beyond the bridge, its fuselage breaking in half but sparing the men inside. They immediately set up a defensive perimeter, fending off a hastily organized German counterattack from the nearby village. The third glider for each objective landed on the near banks, their troops deploying to secure the landing zones and prevent any German forces from interfering with the assault on the bridges. They encountered pockets of resistance, but they fought with a cold, calculated efficiency that was terrifying to behold. They were not just fighting, they were executing a plan that they had rehearsed 100 times. Every man knew his role, every movement was deliberate, every shot was aimed. Inside the German command post, a half-mile from the bridges, Major Hans Schmidt was jolted awake by the sound of gunfire. He stumbled out of his bunk, grabbing his helmet and pistol. His telephone was ringing off the hook. A panicked voice on the other end was screaming about English parachutists and gliders landing on the bridges. Schmidt couldn't believe it. It had to be a mistake. A raid? Here? Now? He ran to the window, and in the distance he could see the orange flicker of tracer fire and hear the unmistakable sound of a battle being fought. "Get me the second company," he yelled at his radio man, "and get the anti-tank gun on the western bank to fire on the bridges. Now!" But it was too late. The British glider troops had already identified the 50mm anti-tank gun as a primary threat. A small team of engineers, under heavy fire, had fought their way to the gun position and had disabled it with a well-placed explosive charge. The German counterattack, when it came, was disorganized and piecemeal. The British glider troops, using the bridges and the surrounding buildings as cover, repulsed it with heavy casualties. The Germans, who had been so confident just an hour earlier, were now in a state of complete disarray. They were being attacked from an unexpected direction by an enemy they couldn't see, using tactics they had never encountered. The fighting was brutal and personal. It was a war of grenades and bayonets, of rifles fired from point-blank range, of men fighting and dying in the darkness within a few feet of one another. In the confusion, a glider pilot who had survived the crash of his aircraft picked up a rifle and joined the fight, his flying skills forgotten in the primal urge to survive. An infantryman, His Bren gun jammed, used it as a club, swinging it with desperate strength at a German soldier who was charging him with a bayonet. A young private, just 19 years old, found himself face to face with a German NCO. Both men fired at the same time. Both missed. The German threw his rifle at the private and drew his pistol. The private, his mind blank with terror, bayoneted the German in the chest, the sound of the blade piercing the man's body a sickening, unforgettable thud. Within 10 minutes, as Major Howard had predicted, both bridges were securely in British hands. The German defenders were either dead, wounded, captured, or in full retreat. The British glider troops had suffered casualties, but they were remarkably light, considering the odds. Lieutenant Brotheridge was dead, and a dozen other men were wounded, but the objective had been secured. The impossible had been achieved. As dawn broke, the full scope of the British victory became apparent. The two bridges, now renamed Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge in honor of the operation, were firmly in British hands. The German defenders, who had been so confident in their fortifications, were either dead or in custody. The British glider troops, exhausted and covered in dust and cordite, began the grim task of clearing the bodies and preparing for the inevitable German counterattack. This content is only supported in Alark Docs. At 7 a.m., as planned, the first British reinforcements arrived. They were not paratroopers but commandos from the 1st Special Service Brigade, who had landed by sea a few miles away. They waded across the fields, their boots heavy with mud, and took over the defense of the bridges, allowing the exhausted glider troops to finally get some rest. The arrival of the reinforcements was a massive relief to the men of the assault force. They had held out against overwhelming odds, but they had done it. They had won. In the days that followed, the bridges at Bénouville became a vital artery for the Allied forces fighting in Normandy. They allowed troops and supplies to be moved east of the Orne River and the Caen Canal without having to cross under fire. Military historians would later estimate that the capture of these bridges in the initial hours of the invasion was one of the most critical single actions of the entire Normandy campaign. It disrupted the German command structure, sowed confusion and panic in their ranks, and gave the Allies a foothold that they desperately needed. The success of the operation was a testament to the courage, skill, and determination of the 180 men who had flown into the heart of enemy territory in flimsy wooden gliders and had achieved what many believed was impossible. The story of the capture of Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge became a legend in the annals of airborne warfare. The men who participated in it were celebrated as heroes, and rightly so. They were awarded numerous decorations for bravery, including several Victoria Crosses. But as the war dragged on and larger, more dramatic operations captured the public's attention, the story of this small, audacious raid began to fade from memory. It became a footnote in the history of D-Day, a small but significant part of a much larger, more complex story. But for the men who were there, the memory of that night never faded. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives, a mix of pride, grief, and the haunting memories of the men who didn't make it back. They were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were ordinary men, clerks, farmers, factory workers, who had been called upon to do something extraordinary. They had answered the call, not for glory or for reward, but out of a sense of duty and a belief in the cause for which they were fighting. Today, the original Pegasus Bridge stands in a museum, a silent testament to the events of that night. A modern bridge stands in its place, carrying the daily traffic of life across the canal. A nearby memorial, a bronze statue of a glider trooper, stands watch over the site, a permanent reminder of the courage and sacrifice of the men of D Company, 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Most passers-by barely notice it, but for those who know the story, it is a place of pilgrimage, a sacred ground where the impossible was made possible. The story of what happened at the Orne River and the Caen Canal is more than just a thrilling tale of military derring-do. It is a story about the limits of human endurance, the power of training and teamwork, and the extraordinary things that ordinary people can achieve when they are pushed to the absolute limit. It challenges our assumptions about warfare, about the importance of numbers and technology, and about the nature of courage itself. It shows us that in the darkest of times, when all seems lost, a small group of determined individuals can change the course of history. The next time you see a bridge, take a moment to think about the stories it could tell. It has seen armies march and empires fall. It has been a symbol of connection and a scene of conflict. It has been the site of desperate battles and quiet moments of reflection. The bridges at Eben-Emael are no different. They stand today not just as structures of steel and concrete, but as monuments to the human spirit, to the men who defied the odds and, for one brief, shining moment, brought a little bit of light into the darkness of a world at war. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as a chapter in a history book, but as a powerful and enduring example of what we, as human beings, are capable of when we dare to do the impossible. If this story of courage and sacrifice has moved you, share it. Let others know about the men who took the bridges, and remind the world that even in the face of overwhelming odds, heroes can still emerge from the shadows.